Hi, welcome to lesson 7.5, MCAT car strategies in action. If you've been following the usual order for these sessions, then actually this is part of your third psych soc class, hence the coronal brain scans all around me. So a word of explanation. This is actually the very last MCAT skills section in your class, if you've been following the usual order. So that's something to celebrate, and we thought it was a good idea to end with one last point grab in the cars section. That is, one more chance for you to really show off and review all the skills and strategies that you've learned in this class. I'm Tyler Farah. Let's begin. Take a look at these learning goals, because what they show you is that you have a strategy from the most bird's eye view of the MCAT down to the most granular detail. That is, when you push start on a section, you're going to start out by triaging to make sure that you pick the right passage to begin with. Having selected a passage, you're going to outline it in a way that quickly earns you the information you need to get points and avoids the nitty-gritty details. And then when you get into the questions, you've got a strategy to methodically attack these questions, and if you ever do get stuck between two answer choices, you've got a strategy to help you decide either which one's more likely to be right or which one falls into some sort of trap and is therefore wrong. As for the strategies themselves, you know these by now, and that's good. You want these not to be tactics that you're deploying for the MCAT, but rather just the way that you attack this test. And so the point of this lesson isn't to look at individual skills and strategies one at a time, but rather to lump all these together and attack a cars passage in the way that you will on test day. Let's go ahead and see that passage. So what I'd like you to do is go through and outline this passage. Make sure to record a label for each of the 4 paragraphs. Also ensure that you do scan the passage and think about whether this is a passage you would do on test day, or would you save it for later. We're describing a philosophical practice, and for a lot of students, this is an immediate sign that this is a passage that should be triaged. On the other hand, the language of this doesn't seem to be that complicated. You see here, skepticism has its benefits. Now, when you see benefits early on, it stands to reason that you might see drawbacks later on. And in fact, here we see exactly that. We see, however, skepticism has its faults. So you might have outlined something like skepticism, advantages and disadvantages. Paragraph 2 starts off with a rhetorical question. This author is saying, hey, skepticism is useful. Here's a bunch of reasons why. Good writing actually often begins with the conclusion and then gives a bunch of evidence to back that conclusion up. What that means for you as a cars reader is that we've identified the conclusion, and therefore we've really identified the whole point of paragraph 2 right away. When is skepticism useful? Now that gives us a whole bunch of detail to parse through as we move through the end of this cars paragraph. So a good strategy that we have for addressing those details is the highlighting strategy. One highlighting strategy is to highlight all of the proper nouns. If a question asks us about James Randi, for example, we want to know exactly where to go to find more information about him. As for paragraphs 3 and 4, I went ahead and highlighted the proper nouns to stick with that strategy. And in paragraph number 3, the author this time kind of varies what he wants to talk about. He says there's lots of stories where a lack of skepticism has led people to believe false things. And then we see the word however. Remember your keyword strategy. This puts me on guard. It says, hey, look for the new information that's coming right next. So our author goes on to say, is there any real danger to believing things like pseudoscience? Well, we've got a pretty clear picture of our author so far. He seems to be a fan of skepticism, and so it seems like our author is going to advocate for being skeptical of a thing like pseudoscience. And so our author goes on to give several examples of how this might be detrimental. He says, skeptics use online communities to get the word out about stories of actual harm caused by belief in the unreal. He goes on to mention a specific website, and and also a podcast that gives real-world stories about people who have life-ruining consequences from belief in false supernatural claims. Our author seems to believe that there are real-world dangers for failing to be a skeptic. In paragraph 4, we see the keyword "so." This tells me that a summary of all the ideas is going to follow, and what our author says is skepticism, it's a good candidate for a reasonable way to look at the world. But as we reflect on these ideas, the last thing that we want to keep in mind is the author's overall tone. So overall, our author is positive about skepticism, but not overwhelmingly so. Lastly, what can be learned from this passage? I'd like you to take a second right now and jot down some of the ideas that were helpful as you read this passage and outlined it, or as we reviewed it right now. The author's tone and opinions are just as important of the content of the passage, and so instead of getting bogged down in the details about skepticism, which could have been intimidating, we sort of floated above those details and picked out the main points as we went. Having read and outlined the passage, in the next portion of this lesson, we're going to earn some points by looking at some MCAT questions. Now let's take a look at a set of CARS questions that are going to require us to apply most of the skills that we've learned in this class. We'd like to take something away from these questions other than just the answer. So notice the prompt on page here. What can you learn from this question? All 5 of the questions in this set have something to teach us, or at least something to review, that represents an important CARS strategy. So keep that in mind as we take a look at question 1. Now, question 1 is a which of the following question, and it asks for a disadvantage of skepticism, and it even tells us where to go in the first paragraph. But then it takes a turn for the worse, because this one goes on to say, and is also something the author fails to counter in the subsequent paragraphs. In other words, to answer question 1, we not only have to go back to paragraph 1, we also have to go back and check all the other paragraphs to make sure that it was mentioned in paragraph 1 and then not brought up again in the subsequent paragraphs. This sounds like an awful lot of work. In fact, it sounds like the kind of question where if we had a little bit better knowledge of the passage, maybe if we'd gone back to the paragraphs a couple times already, then we'd have a much better shot at answering this question pretty quickly. In other words, this sounds like the kind of question that is perfect to triage. And in fact, not only are we going to have a chance to research the passage on some of the other questions before we come back to question 1, now we know actually what to look for. So if we go back to the passage for question 2, we're going to try to answer question 2, but then we're also going to look for information that might help us on question 1. That is, we're going to look for our author countering disadvantages, because if our author counters a disadvantage in paragraph 2 or 3 or 4, then that's a disadvantage that we can rule out. On the other hand, we want to do as much work as possible on this question now, since it's right here in front of us. Even if we are not going to be able to find the whole right answer without doing a lot of research in the passage, we could still move on to the plan and execute steps by predicting, well, the right answer has got to be a disadvantage in the first place. Take a look at letter A. Skepticism is a method of reasoning through information. That's not a disadvantage, so we can rule it out. How about letter B? Skepticism can identify untrue information. That actually sounds like an advantage of skepticism, so we can rule that one out as well. And what that means is, if we want to find the answer, C versus D, we're going to have to spend a lot of time researching the passage. But now we have options. We can guess between C and D and then move on, or we can triage this question and look for more information about our author countering disadvantages as we go. Let's take the second route and go ahead and triage the heavy lifting of this question for later on. Now, on question 2, we're going to take a little bit more straightforward approach to this question. For one thing, it gives us a specific paragraph reference. For another thing, we can easily identify the question type. This tells us to suppose something, which means we're given new information, which means this is a reasoning beyond question. And we're asked, how should a skeptic react to this new information? information. So this is asking us to apply information about skeptics to new information. Therefore, it's an application question. At this moment, I'm going to turn this question over to you. Go ahead and assess, plan, execute, and answer this question. Take a moment and find your answer right now. Now, I want you to think honestly how you attack this question, because a lot of students are going to jump right back to paragraph 3 looking for more information about this guy, Brian Dunning. But actually, the point of this question is, how would a skeptic react to some kind of information? If we think about the big picture of this passage, a skeptic would probably react to this or any information by being skeptical. So you might have actually moved straight from the plan step to the execute step by coming up with a prediction that was something along the lines of, a skeptic would be skeptical of this information. Which answer choice shows a skeptic being skeptical? Well, letter B, researching the information in other sources than the podcast itself. And there's the answer. Now, what I'd like you to do is reflect for a moment on what lesson this question has to teach us about attacking cars in general. Go ahead and jot something down for this now. One big takeaway from question number 2 is that just because we were given a passage reference, that doesn't necessarily mean we had to go back to the passage. And part of your plan step should always be, do I need to go back to the passage at all? In addition to, where should I go if I have to go back to the passage? In this case, the answer was no. We don't need to go back to the passage to answer this question. So don't reflexively go straight back to the passage. In question 3, we're asked about skepticism as a general mode of thought. And we're asked, what would the author think about this? This is a signifier that we're looking at an inference question. That is, the author hasn't directly said whatever the answer choice is, but it's the sort of thing that the author would say. So with that little bit of setup, go through the plan, execute, and answer steps on your own and come to an answer for this question. Now, what stands out to me about this question is that it's asking about how our author feels. So remember, all those details and all those examples that the author gave in the passage, those are basically equal in importance to how the author feels about different things in terms of what's most likely to earn us points on the MCAT. So right here, we have one of those questions asking us, what does the author think? In the big picture, what are his feelings? And in a single word, when it comes to our author and skepticism, he thinks good. That might have been your prediction on this question as you moved into the execute step. And if you were looking to find an answer choice that matches that prediction, there's only one that does. Our author believes that skepticism is a good thing and he would support its use in evaluating information. That's a perfect match to a very simple prediction. Take a second and again, think about a takeaway from this question and jot down some notes about what you learned from question number 3. A big takeaway for me on question 3 is that a general prediction is often all you need. In fact, think about the two alternatives. On one hand, you can make a very general prediction. Our prediction here was good. The author thinks this is good. In this case, that got us all the way to the right answer, but maybe a general prediction only gets us down to a 50-50. Well, in that scenario, you can use wrong answer pathologies to eliminate the dispute, you can guess and move on, or you can simply re-predict with a little bit more specific prediction, basically revisit your execute step, and then answer the question from there. The point is, if you make a general prediction and it doesn't get you all the way to the right answer, you've got options, and you can keep honing your attack until you're down to one final answer. On the other hand, very often I see students trying to make very, very specific predictions that end up not matching with any of the answers. In that case, you've spent a lot of time for no benefit. So as a general rule of thumb, start with a general prediction, something that's bigger picture, that's less specific, and see how far that gets you, and then calibrate your approach from there. So far, we've answered 2 MCAT questions and chosen to triage 1. In the third and final portion of this lesson, we're going to take a look at 2 more questions and we'll swoop back and get that question that we triaged along the way. In this final portion of this lesson, we're going to answer 2 more MCAT questions. And of course, let's not forget about the question that we chose to triage in part 2 of this lesson. Here, in question 4, we see another specific paragraph reference. But let's be a little more careful this time, because we got burned by that specific paragraph reference on question 2. First, let's think, do we really need to go back to the passage? And in this case, we're asked for the exact kind of detail that we probably didn't spend much time paying attention to as we read this passage. But now paragraph 4 has said, hey, this specific detail is really important. You should go back and find it and answer this question using it. You might use that strategy to go back and find the detail that was mentioned, or you might also rely on an elimination strategy to eliminate the details that weren't mentioned. Either way, I'm going to leave it up to you to go ahead and earn this MCAT point, assess, plan, execute, and answer question 4. Go ahead and do that right now. In paragraph number 2, you probably found the detail. In this way, the connection that can potentially be lost is gained through sharing with similar-minded people. That's a perfect match for letter B, to show that skeptics can still share connections based on their way of thinking. If you went the other way, a process of elimination, take a look at letter A. To counter the argument that there is no harm. This was a detail from paragraph 3, this idea of harm based on something unreal, so this is also kind of a faulty use of detail. As for letter C, this is out of scope for this particular question. The reason why is our author talks about the harm that can be felt from believing in pseudoscientists, but he doesn't talk about whether pseudoscientists themselves are good or bad, or whether they can do good in the world. And as for letter D, this is another faulty use of detail because our author is not out to highlight the harmful influence of psychics like Uri Geller. That's just a detail that gets mentioned about James Randi, but the real point of James Randi was to show that skeptics can come together. So before we move on past question 4, take a moment and answer the prompt on screen. What is a good takeaway lesson from question number 4? A big takeaway for me on question 4 is that you should go back to the passage when you know exactly where to go. On question 1, we didn't know exactly where to go, and so we decided to triage. In question 2, we said, wait a minute, I don't actually need to go back to the passage here, so let's not go back to the passage. But now on question 4, we did have to go back to the passage, but they told us exactly where to go and what to look for. So this was a really good question to go back to the passage right now. And in fact, you might have noticed this is kind of a double benefit. Because remember in question 1, we said, well, we're going to do some more passage research in these other questions, and that might help us along the way. It looks like that just paid off. I'll show you what I mean. If we now return to question 1. Now remember, we were able to rule out A and B because the question asks for a disadvantage, and A represented a neutral fact about skepticism, where B actually represented an advantage of skepticism. So C and D are both disadvantages, but we're not asked just for a disadvantage. We're asked for a disadvantage in the first paragraph, but that the author also fails to counter in the subsequent paragraph. Well, in question 4, we saw the author countering one of the disadvantages. That is to say, in paragraph 1, the author said, another disadvantage of skepticism is losing the connection with others. And then in paragraph 2, he showed a way that we could actually counter that disadvantage through that big festival that was mentioned in paragraph 4 that brought all kinds of skeptics together to share their beliefs. What that tells us is that letter D is a disadvantage that was countered. Now, I want you to take the last step and actually answer this question. Be very careful of what the question itself is asking for. Go ahead and do that right now. This question says, if you are a disadvantage that the author fails to counter, then you're the right answer. So if you are a disadvantage that the author does counter, then you're a wrong answer. That means letter D, the disadvantage in paragraph 1 that was countered in paragraph 2 is a wrong answer. And that leaves us with letter C, the right answer. Notice that here, an elimination strategy was absolutely the best strategy. Because if we wanted to answer this question information outright, we would have had to recognize the disadvantage represented by letter C and then literally read the whole rest of the passage over just to make sure that C never popped up again. Instead, we ruled out A, B, and D, and we were able to use a process of elimination to find letter C. Go ahead and jot down a big takeaway for you, something that you can learn from this question. Do that right now. One of the big messages of question 1 is that smart triaging decisions earn points. For our last question in this review of CAR's strategies, I'd like to give you free rein. Go ahead and assess, plan, execute, and answer this question all on your own right now. Assess. This question uses the word inference, which is a really good hint that it is an inference question. That means that in the plan step, we want to start to think about our author overall. This guy seems to advocate for skepticism. In fact, he probably is himself a skeptic. So our author would react to new information in the same way that any skeptic would, by being skeptical. That means then in the execute step, we can think about, well, how do skeptics react to new information? Our author tells us that they're skeptical. That is, they're not out to disbelieve or disprove everything, but they want to challenge new claims and find additional supporting evidence before a skeptic will accept a new claim as, in fact, true. Overall, the answer choice that matches up with that prediction is letter A. The author would view that information as plausible given adequate support. Now, there is another way to attack question number 5, and that is to use an elimination strategy. Take a look at letter B. Our author would not believe any of the assertions in the new information. That's a really extreme claim. In fact, that's what makes letter B a wrong answer. Our author would not necessarily reject the information outright, and anything that could be supported, our author would eventually come to view as viable, good information. Similarly, for letter C, the author could consider this information valid only if other skeptics also did. That's also pretty extreme. And finally, letter D, the author would want to believe the information and attempt to support it. Again, this is too extreme. That's not what skeptics do, so letter D is out. A really good takeaway for question 5 is that inferences are things that are not stated in the passage directly, but they must be true based on what was stated in the passage. If an answer choice is more of a middle-of-the-road, kind of qualified answer choice, like letter A, he may believe the information as plausible, that's more likely a statement that must be true. There's nothing wrong with it, and there's no flaw that will make it wrong. This lesson ends with a list of all the learning goals from the chapters related to CARS. And you saw a lot of that information come back up in this lesson. In CARS 6.3, again, we had a few other question types, and we certainly saw some inference questions today, and we even saw an apply question. In Chapter 7, we saw some of the more advanced CARS strategies. For example, arguments, conclusions based on evidence. And we used that argument strategy to help us with paragraph 2 of the passage in this lesson. And also, looking at the CARS question types and triaging in the CARS sections are both strategies that we employed on this CARS passage. That concludes lesson 7.5, and what you should take away from this lesson is that you have an entire arsenal of strategies to use to make you successful on this test. Also, if you followed the usual order of lessons, this also is your last MCAT skills session. Congratulations! Of course, the next step is to continue to perfect your approach as you apply these strategies and put them in action to earn points on this test. Good luck on your studies and enjoy your coming success.